I just started the recording for our meeting.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I mean, it's very kind of Terry. With our help, we'll do a final edit of the recording, but we want to have a recording available for all of those folks who won't be able to join us today, but still want to join us at some point in time. Hello, Cindy. Great.
And Cindy is happens to be my niece, as well as the vice president at Cisco.
Yeah, well,
excellent.
Terry's done work with Cisco, so maybe that's where she may have heard of.
Wonderful. Thank you for the invitation. I can only attend for 30 minutes, but I'm very excited to see what you all are working on. From what I saw on the website, it's fascinating. So thank you so much, Cindy.
Yeah. I was just saying to people, Cindy, that, Terry, you worked at Cisco or worked with folks at Cisco for a while, quite a few years back, didn't you?
I did, with over 500 of the, I'm trying to remember what the acronym for the teams were, but the teams that go in and fix things when the customer says, oh my goodness, this isn't going well.
Oh, so yes, that's wonderful. Very good. Well, it's good to meet you, Terry.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So am I co-host? Will I be able to create the breakouts, or is somebody going to do that for me?
I am going to make you a co-host right now. Okay. And
So,
you can either do it or I can do it. Or
so Terry, if we don't go much beyond the numbers we have on the call now, we can probably handle the discussion as one large group, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you guys make that.
Yeah.
When we
Yeah.
get to that point.
Yeah. We'll make the call.
All right.
And see what our numbers are like.
Yeah.
And you should be able to put up your slides so we can share slide screen. But I just want to very briefly introduce you and then turn it over to you.
All right. Well, what I'm going to suggest, because I'm using you may have heard of it, is I'm not going to share my slides. I'm going to just have my background be the slides, and I will set that up to work a little bit better here. And what you're probably going to want to do is to pin me, perhaps. Let's see how that's.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the way to go. And if you've got me pinned, I'll go ahead and.
Okay, I just want to introduce you, Terry, very briefly.
All right, perfect.
In all respect of your modesty, I do want to welcome everybody, and particularly Dr. Terri Griffith, who is a professor, author, speaker, consultant. I'll say a bit more about Terry, but a very accomplished person. And this is the second in a series of workshops that we've organized as a prelude to our global network gathering in Austin, Texas on September 27th to the 30th on the theme of organizing work fit for humans in the digital age. And our topic today, I think, really does fit with that theme, a topic being really the examination of work crafting as an STS bottom-up design process by thinking in what Terry describes as 5T. Terry is someone who has got a long familiarity with STS, particularly, I think, Terry, beginning with your PhD program at Carnegie Mellon, where you had Paul Goodman as your advisor. And in her own way, Terry's been applying STS for quite a few years in business schools and management schools, particularly at the University of Santa Clara. Very fortunately, she very recently has moved her professorship to my hometown, Vancouver, Canada. And Terry is now the chair for innovation and entrepreneurship at the School of Business at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. I would say that Terry is going to make at least two contributions to us today. One of them is to introduce us to a rapidly emerging field of job crafting, or as Terry describes it, work crafting, as a bottom-up STS design process that focuses particularly on the ability of individuals to design their own work, which is a little bit different from what we tend to do with large-scale, organization-centric interventions. So it's an interesting complement to what we're doing. And I think the second contribution is to introduce us and share with us some a quite distinctive, I would say, practitioner-friendly framework of terminology for STS, which Terri calls 5T. So I think both of those can be helpful to us. We will take a couple of short breaks to allow you to sort of process this information. So we've got a lot to learn and do in the next hour and a half. So Terri, I want to turn it over quickly to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bert. And yes, it was quite a lovely thing to discover that I had moved into Bert's territory. So we've had the chance to get together, in Vancouver. The one thing I do want to adjust is I hold the Keith Beattie Chair, an endowed chair in innovation and entrepreneurship. My colleague, Sarah Lubick, is actually the chair of the area. So the lovely thing about my role is it's not administrative. So I'm very happy about that part. And I'm going to give a little bit of my background. So we started off with my PhD, and yes, I was at Carnegie Mellon. I was working with Paul Goodman, but I remember the formative course being one in the history of technology. And it was that course where I really came to understand the evolution of how we use technology and all its component parts and how it touches every other aspect of organizational design. And let me just share a little bit of that journey. So from Carnegie Mellon, I went to the University of Arizona. And actually, here I am backing up a little bit. In 1984, this wasn't my dissertation, but it was my first research project ever, looking at telecommuting. And I remember Paul, I came into him and I said, there's some grant money available, and this is what I want to do, is this study of telecommuting. Pittsburgh was still at the time a major headquarters city, so maybe number 4, number 5 in terms of most headquarters of companies. And I remember Paul just sort of shaking his head and going, oh, that's whatever. and then about a week later, he came back and he said, maybe we should think about that. And so this ends up being our first paper on telecommuting. And so as you might guess, all of that work has become really important again. And on the introduction slide, you saw a link down at the bottom that said hybridwork.socialsignal.com. And I'm partnering up with some other folks who do a lot of work in hybrid work because the companies need so much support right now. And so it's kind of come full circle there. But from the telecommuting work, I moved to the University of Arizona. I do a fair amount of work on group decision support systems and how people integrate that kind of a technology and process into their work. Then around the 2010s, I'm working with Cisco and DuPont on how different teams integrate technology and their own expertise to solve problems. And more recently is this bottom-up aspect of how do we all add automation to the kinds of work that we're doing. And so I leave for others the top-down applications of automation and AI, but that leaves plenty of room to support the individuals with their work and how different kinds of automation could actually be happy. So kind of bringing system savvy to the masses is how I describe that one. And I'll talk a little bit more about system savvy as we go along. But the map for today is to give you the basics of work crafting. It's an explosive area, and a lot of the folks take it on in terms of performance, but really more people even take it on in terms of quality of work life, something that I know is near and dear to you all's hearts. And then, as Bert said, I've got a slightly different framing of socio-technical systems that I call thinking in 5T. And then the last portion of the talk is really having us all think about how this perspective might or might not fit into your practice and how it either is aligned or not with your own experience in your practice. So let's work on those definitions a little bit. Job crafting, sort of something that gets identified around 2001, is significant, semi-permanent personal adjustments to work. So I'm sorry? Okay, I thought I heard someone asking a question. So it's the individual thinking about their own work design rather than the organization. And the organization may have been involved because they may have provided training on job crafting. They may have sort of, given their permission to craft your own work, but the decision-making itself about the design is coming from the bottom up. And as I mentioned, a lot of this initial work focused on identity, meaning, well-being, sort of the quality of work-life aspects. And what we're going to see for me is more of a focus on the performance side. And this is the foundational paper, so 2001. And that just spurs something that if you do any kind of citation searches, you just see this incredible explosion of studies saying that this is an appropriate way to support people on their jobs. Just really kind of highlighting a little bit more about, is it something that people can do? Is it something that people can do well? There's a question there. And then what are the outcomes that are a result of this? And I will say, I'm going to share the slide deck afterwards. So all those references will be available to you if you care to have them. But I do like to summarize this sort of job crafting aspect. And so if you think about all the different perspectives on job crafting, the most important split is it about people trying to figure out how to do their job better? Or is it about the negative side? How do I do less on the job? How do I foist this thing off on someone else that I don't want to do? Or how do I avoid working with someone that I don't want to work with? And then on the approach side, more, what tool could I use that could make things be better in my job? How could I adjust my process? So I would claim that in your own practice, you're working towards the approach side. And if anything, you're saying, how do we avoid the avoidance side? Right. So from the top-down perspective that practitioners take as they're supporting organizations, sort of supporting the approach and trying to protect against the avoidance component. Then we've also got this idea of behavioral versus cognitive. So behavioral are actual changes that I make. So I bring on a new kind of technology tool, I adjust a practice in a certain way, I learn something new that's going to help me on my job. The cognitive is I change the way I think about it. So maybe I thought that doing this particular process was really just busy work. And then I come to understand, no, it's really critical to the, say, quality assurance of the work that's being done. That would be a mental shift. So that cognitive crafting aspect. And then resources versus demands are, how do I find new tools, new capabilities, new processes that I could use versus demands? How do I limit the work, not limiting the work in the way that avoidance crafting is, but how do I adjust the demands on me? Like maybe I change my KPIs or something like that, right? Adjusting that aspect, or saying, here's an easier way. We don't need to do that particular task that's taking me so much time. I can adjust the demand side. Now, for me, I'm going to show a split here, in that I'm really focusing on a narrow arm of this full chart. Like I said, there's an explosive area of work. So if other aspects are of great interest to you, no doubt that there will be plenty of studies to support you in your efforts. So there's a depiction of that. And you'll also see that I've changed the framing just a little bit. The research tends to call it job crafting, and it's because they're working inside the organizations. They are typically focused on traditional employees. Some other scholars have started to say, well, why do we want to put that kind of constraint on ourselves? What about the gig workers? Don't we care about them too? And of course we do. And of course we care about sole practitioners, and maybe this skill set is going to be valuable to them as well. So I broaden a little bit by calling it work crafting, get in the gig and the freelancers as well. But I'm very specifically focused on the resource aspect. So I'm just taking that one arm of the work because I want to help people think about how to adjust their work towards their performance. My expertise is not so much on the meaning and well-being side of things. So I stick to what I know, and what I know is on that performance side. We do have a fair amount of data, even going back a ways. It affects performance. It affects employability. And I think all of you can see that as you think about the folks who are doing work, who are perhaps most aligned with the interventions that you're offering inside organizations. Those folks kind of understand the work, and they try and go forward on those organizational goals. And that's seen as a positive. It's going to be positive to their own work production, and it's something that probably makes them, a more highly sought after employee for future work. And I sort of ran through that because I wanted to get us to a discussion point. And we can certainly keep our notes in that Google slide document. That's a technique I use when I'm doing workshops, where we have this Google slide document. And so we would have done breakout groups, and then each breakout group would have used it kind of as their own personal whiteboard. The beauty of that is that it enables everybody to see all those breakouts. As Bert said, I think we're with a group. Bert, are we still small enough that we?
Yeah, I think so. There's really 8 or so of us besides yourself, right, Terry. So yeah, let's stay in the larger group. And this will make the recording even more valuable, perhaps. So. Okay.
So in that case, let me take one peek here. Yes, I'm where I want to be. So the focal question, what you would be seeing on your slides here is, questions you have, observations that come to mind regarding your own practice and what you might have seen as people do this. They don't need to know that it's work crafting, but if you've seen it, I'd love to hear your example. Answer any questions about the broad structure of this idea of job and work crafting.
Yeah. Okay, any questions or observations before Terry goes into this in more depth?
Yeah, and note that this was like a 10-minute section. Yeah. We would have said hello to our colleagues. I guess we've done a little bit of that already.
Yeah. Terry, I'm so excited. I apologize. I've got this, my son is texting me at the same time, but I love your topic. I feel like had we worked at Cisco at the same time, we would have been like sisters, Cisco sisters. But a couple things. I've encountered several folks that use automation because they find that the work that they've been handed when they enter a role, the work that they've been handed, they can automate their way into a 2-hour workday or less. And they don't tell anyone that that's the case. So super interesting. They perform at or better than the level expected, but they save the productivity gain for themselves. So that's just one observation I find super, super interesting. I think we should.
And yet, Cindy, you know about it.
Yes, because the spouse of the individual told me. So yeah, so interesting. Oh, my husband, he has all this free time because he knows how to automate this. Super interesting. Yeah. And so there are so many tracks to go down from the automation and crafting your own work. But one of the things I've done research on is when we use automation inside large corporations, there are data sets out there that are loaded with bias. And most individual contributors are not aware of the bias that is in the data. So because data is a reflection of humans are biased, therefore it's codified. And so I'm curious to see if you've done any research on the unintentional negative consequences of individuals codifying or automating or crafting their own role that could amplify biases. I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the first part, the automating your job and who keeps the gain. And I started keeping some notes for us, and please add to them as we go in the chat. You know, Reddit has a beautiful thread, and I'll try and track that thread down and share it with the group later, about the first instance of someone going public in a broad way, and all the back and forth about, you know, the moral obligation there. And that is a very interesting question. You know, if I'm a freelancer, as long as I'm charging by the hour, obviously there's no trouble at all. If I'm a salaried employee, then it's a bigger question about what is the expectation of the organization? What is that implicit contract we have? Are they buying the work to be done at that fixed rate? Or are they buying, you know, 8 hours of my day? Or if they're Elon Musk, they're buying 16 hours of my day. Right? You know, so those are very interesting questions, and I think need to be part of what we discuss in terms of work. If you could go back historically, I know STS has just got such a great historical base, and the idea of shirking. And then from the flip side, you know, the time management people squeezing every moment out of every day, you know, kind of the two ends of the spectrum there. And for me, you know, transparency is the key for me. You know, some organizations are buying your day, your life. Some organizations are buying the work output. And I think we need to be honest and transparent about that. And then, you know, it's an easier conversation to have. In terms of the bias data, and I'll give us a particular example. Let's say what I'm automating is the codification of our company's photo database. And that before we were maybe hiring a bunch of gig workers or something, and they were all saying cat, dog, muffin, book, right? We had humans doing that. And now what we're doing is we're relying on different AI models that have the capability to do those classifications. But as Cindy notes, we know those classification training models are often biased and can result in really terrible outcomes, as Google certainly has walked into a time or two. So,
could I raise something that's a little bit different twist on this, Terri? My son works at Google, and he does work on internet security, network security kind of stuff, and it's mysterious and very techy and all that. All of the people on his team have projects that they're working on. Sometimes they got 2 or 3 of them working together. You know, it's the usual kind of way techs work in a chaotic manner. But one of the other things that they have is that there is a monitoring role that they have where what we used to call them in the Navy was gripes, or where there are problems that come up from customers. And so they rotate in his group that responsibility to responding to the gripes. And what my son does when he has that duty is that he will only respond to gripes every day or two, because it tends to be an interruption and keeps him from being able to get his other work done. So he will let the gripes pile up in his inbox, and then he will hammer them all out very quickly, because he's very bright and he's very quick, and he can hammer them out satisfactorily. And that way he is managing his time and his resource. But then there is a pushback from his boss saying, yes, but we want to respond to the gripes within X number of minutes. And my son and a couple of others in the group have responded to the boss by saying, these are not urgent gripes. These are not the house is burning down gripes. These are things that need to be attended to, but are not what we would call urgent. And so I've been very interested in this conversation with he and his colleagues, because they are, in essence, as I see it, doing work crafting in the way that some of them choose to let this pile up so it's not as much of an interruption, whereas others want to, oh my gosh, I have to handle this as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so, and I'll complicate it a little bit, and I'm going to claim that since he's working at Google, he he has the capability to do this. If you told me that then they had turned on some kind of a sentiment analysis that let them be more assured that it's true that they're not urgent,
Yes.
right? Because that's an assumption. But you could have, the first filter could be that automated one where it's looking for sentiment and you're not seeing a bunch of swear words or a bunch of your driving my business into the ground kind of things.
Right.
And that would send off a signal. I'm thinking, wow, those guys are brilliant, right?
Yeah.
If truly bunching them, not even glancing at them to do that filter, then if I'm the boss, I'm like, how do you guys know? Show me the last 6 months. Is that always true? And maybe I'll take that risk, do that analysis. And even then we go back to Cindy's point about, well, any sentiment model you're using has probably got some kind of a bias in it. And you could imagine the bias would be different ethnic groups spelling differently. And so the model isn't picking it up, or they couch things in a far more polite way than, say, a North American male might. And so the North American males are the ones who are actually getting the quick response and everybody else is being left hanging. And that kind of a bias is something that I have to rely on the AI specialists to help us with. But I think all of us, even though, and I won't make an assumption here, but I know I am not an AI trainer, all of us need to educate folks about the bias issues. And I think anyone who does the kind of reading we do is aware that those biases exist. And that's going to be in the back of our minds as we're using tools like this. On the other hand, I think you go down just a little bit in terms of folks who don't think about work design and don't read different kinds of newsletters and the like, maybe not even reading the Wall Street Journal, not reading, New York Times, where they're going to do long form pieces on this. That's where we have to be sure that we're saying, it's great that you use that sentiment model to do that first round. How are you making sure that there isn't this kind of bias? Could you have some other team in the organization verify for us that that bias isn't existing in that particular database? And the big organizations can do that. If I'm a smaller, sole practitioner who's maybe responding to gripes as an independent contractor, and I've figured out this kind of cool approach, then I may need to be querying my vendor about how do we know that there aren't these kinds of biases. But having that be part of our workflow and highlighting that part of the workflow. And Cindy, what you're making me think is I should highlight that part of the workflow, even as I'm presenting this idea that we do these trade-offs across talent, technology, and technique.
Yeah. Could I just jump in, Terry? Because there's a couple of observations I would make that you can maybe correct or add to that come from what Cindy and Peter just said. I think there's a difference between what might be work crafting that occurs implicitly and work crafting that occurs explicitly, where it is an understood practice organizationally. I mean, what Cindy's identifying is something that happened implicitly, quite informally. As well, what you're describing, Pete, is something that's done informally. If it's explicit, there may be processes of negotiation required amongst individuals on a team or between individuals and the organization, except, for example, to deal with issues of bias or whether there may be some potential conflict between performance targets that you're talking about, Pete. So I mean, this is where I think as Terry goes further into this, and when we get sort of more a hold of the concept, Terry, there are ways of handling some of the issues that Cindy and Pete are identifying if it becomes an explicit practice of work crafting in an organization.
The one thing I would add to that, and Terry, and I agree, if you can include this in your content, that'd be brilliant. So it was my own effort to automate a workflow within a very large organization. So not automating a workflow for 6,000 engineers here at Cisco. And it was founded, the basis of being able to automate it was on this database that we use where people self-report their expertise. And we had just started to begin the automation. And I thought, wait a minute, I had read some article that said, hey, women do not represent their expertise at the same level that men do. And so we did an assessment, and absolutely, I can give you all the data that shows all the self-assessment bias. And it was literally because as a female, and we're 95% male, so I just happened to be in the right role with the right gender to say, wait a minute, maybe we have a problem here. And so that's my concern. What are all the other biases that I'm not aware of, that I'm not motivated to understand? What about all the individuals who aren't even aware of the concept of bias, the concept of digging deeper? So it's super careful when people are in control, and I believe people should automate their jobs to the best of their ability, so they can craft, to your point, the role that they want. But to what cost? And how do we make how do we educate people broadly on how to understand and do research around those potential caveats?
Yeah. So if we start out with the three R's, and I'm trying to write this as I think it through, we start out with the 3 R's. Then I'm going to say we have the 5 T's, and then we need to add the downsides or the checks. And I'm sure that we could come up with a great phrasing for it to make it, sticky, because I think that's a lot of what I'm going to go into is we know this stuff, but it's not sticky in the world, and it needs to be sticky in the world. So we need reading, writing, arithmetic, and we need the 5 T's as I'm going to present them here in a second. And we need to have these kind of process checks. I don't even know if process checks is the right term, so I'll put that in quotes.
Okay.
I call it intellectual curiosity. So I don't know if it, like, how do we promote the right level of intellectual curiosity amongst our teams to think where all the ways this could go wrong?
Right. That's a useful addition. Okay. Ken, do you have a comment, or Nancy, before we move on? We've got a couple more minutes.
I'd be glad just to say I'm just really intrigued by Cindy's example of the person that's got the 2-hour workday, and I'm thinking about that the 8-hour workday is a sort of a U.S. Specific thing. In most other countries, it's much smaller. It'd be quite interesting to say, yes, you can, if you can do it in 2 hours, that's wonderful, but the limit is that you need to put in at least 5 hours, or you need to put in at least 6 hours, or something that's a limit, or some. Otherwise, if you speak against that and say, okay, you still need to work 6 hours more, then you really are moving against this idea of so if there was some sort of limit to that, and more importantly, maybe if there's something that you could do in those other 6 hours or 3 hours or whatever it is, that is of benefit or creative, or it's like the 20% rule, the 3M, where this is on your own kind of thing. That seems possible to me.
Yeah. Okay. You may have a comment on that, Terry, but Ken, do you want to interject anything from your perspective?
Yes. If I could, so I'm just surprising that hearing the message from this socio-technical system roundtable. So because I've been running my seminar in Japan about job crafting, but so recently the point of view has shifted from job crafting to life crafting in senior society, because I have a lot of senior students come from general as a general student from the society, and so I apply the same idea to them. So how do you change your life? So this is my impression and about the work crafting. But so I'm so happy to hear the work crafting idea of work crafting. It's so exciting for me. Thank you.
Good, good. All right. Well, look, Terry, I think we can move on, I think. Is there anybody else that has got a burning question or comment to jump in before we move on?
All right, and please do use the chat so that I can, when we get to another stopping point, I can go back and pick up things. I'd hate to have anybody forget the idea as it comes along. All right, so now I'm gonna get into sort of the troubling pieces of this. It's not troubling in terms of the approach itself, but what is troubling is that lay people are bad at the work that you all do. And I guess, it has job security for all of us, right? If people in general are not very good at work crafting or life crafting, either one. And without the support and the training, so either training for me as an individual, maybe this is something I learn in school and then I bring it forward into my career, or maybe this is something that my organization is so supportive of that it trains. And that's where most of this research is coming from, is the organization has said, this is something we want. And so what we're going to do is train our folks on how to do it. And we're actually going to be supportive of it and give people the time to do it and do it well, maybe give them access to data that they might not have otherwise had. But if you don't have that kind of training, either from earlier in your career or from your organization more particularly, people are not good at it. They design jobs that maybe they saw in, Cheaper by the Dozen, the original version, that efficiency is all the key and repetitive nature is all the key. And that's the kind of work they design if left to their own devices. So what that says is we have to find a way to make socio-technical approaches more everyday practices and find a way to support people in making adjustments to their work. Also, the academics are not especially good at it, which means we don't really have all the data that we want. Now, I'll say we have beautiful data across the aspect of work crafting that Ken was talking about, more of the positive organizational psychology piece. And in the chat, I mentioned that the Michigan folks, so that 2001 article is coming from two colleagues at Michigan. They have developed an entire center that is, has global reach, and everyone's coming to those ideas on that right-hand side. But what we don't really see in the academic literature is good tests of different ways of mixing talent, technology, and technique. And let me just offer up some examples here. 51 years after Tristan Bamforth, 1951, which is where I always put the stake in the ground, the beginning of socio-technical systems, where we learned from the long wall method of cold getting about the tight ties across work process and technology and people's talents. We find that the academics are just not including that in the literature. They are not including the multiple dimensions. They tend to take a talent focus or a technique focus, and not always do they even link the talent and the technique. They very rarely include the technology, which made some sense in the early days when technology was kind of the plumbing. And in fact, if you look at Galbraith's star, that may be something you've used either, in your own background and training, or maybe you use it effectively today. That approach doesn't include technology in an explicit way. It's included you could say, well, it's in the systems aspect of it, but technology is strategic today. Technology has risks, as Cindy was pointing out, in terms of those biases. We have to think about it explicitly. And yet, the scholars weren't doing it 51 years after Tristan Bamforth. They weren't doing it 56 years after Tristan Bamforth. They were doing it 68 years after Trist and Bamforth. 70 years, still, people are saying, where is the technology in this mix? we aren't doing as great a job. And I should say, in each of these cases, it's a proportional issue, that it's a tiny proportion of the academic work on how people do their jobs and how people perform at work that actually ties in technology. And so here we are today, 71 years after that article comes out, and the foundational ideas are clear to you all. So I mean, I am literally here preaching to the choir, to use that idiom. But thinking about, as you go into organizations, how foreign are these ideas? And let me take a peek here and see if I want to stop for a minute. I'm going to stop here because I know there's been some stuff going on in the chat. I want to look at what people are sharing. So, and if you have a question, you just want to raise it verbally, please go ahead and do it.
I just wanted to say that Cindy made a comment, Peter, I think your son's boss may have leadership deficiencies. And I love that. And I went ahead and put that article by Duhigg about teams at Google, and then the comment that, that article and the research that Google did was just absolutely wonderful. And yet the reality of what I hear, not just from Google, but from, almost all the tech companies that I interact with, that they still struggle, even though there is knowledge about what ought to be done or what a set of best practices are. The ability to actually do that and get beyond self-interest and get to what can really work to achieve results that are measured not just by productivity in terms of organizational measures, but human measures and societal measures. It's really hard to do that. A lot easier to talk about it than it is to do it.
Agreed.
Cindy,
Peter, and I would say, for sure. No, and I would say, Peter, Cisco has done the same, very in-depth research. Marcus Buckingham, I'm sure there's a book over here somewhere. Marcus Buckingham, he actually partnered with Cisco to create the concept of taking strengths-based, not leadership, but individuals, all of your strengths, and helping us codify that into a measure of engagement and happiness. But to your point, the challenge is that, at least in tech companies, that's my view. Yeah. We promote the most technically competent person into leadership. Yes. We do not promote the most emotionally competent person. And so we have amazing tools available to us, but our leaders are often not equipped to stop and understand that their role is to maximize the productivity and happiness and engagement of their teams. And I think what Terri is sharing with us in crafting a job is about maximizing how you show up as an individual in the organization to maximize your contribution. And I don't think that the majority of our leaders in the tech world, I have to say that, in the tech world, can do that.
The only thing I would add to that, Cindy, is I don't think you should say just the tech world, because I have worked across many industries over the last 50 years, and I see that same thing you're talking about in every aspect of organizing, not just businesses, but not-for-profits and governments that I've worked for. There's somehow a tendency that we as humans have to select technically proficient people rather than leadership proficiency or emotional intelligence proficiency people. Yeah. And unless we deliberately move against that trend, it will be the dominant trend.
Yeah. Terri, you may have seen Larissa's question in the chat there. Larissa, do you want to put your question out on the floor for us?
Sure, thanks, Bert. And thank you so much, Terri and Ken and everyone for your thoughts. I can't help but think about, the threads that are coming together for me, Pete, from what you're saying about Google's Project Aristotle, psychological safety being at the core of the effectiveness of those teams, Ken talking about life crafting, Terri talking about work crafting. to me, this speaks to, in more general terms, about returning autonomy. About returning autonomy with the premise that people engage with work based on a set of values, on a desire to contribute. And so when Cindy talks about, okay, someone self-automated their job to reduce their time inputs by maybe 60%, what are organizations rewarding employees for, or workers for? Are they rewarding them for contributions or for time, right? Because the question was, who's benefiting from this efficiency measure, right? The self-efficiency measure. So it's a shift in mindset, as we're talking, which increases trust, which rewards contribution, which is more integrated with a way of being than with power over, or, which is the way organizations by and large function, is that we have to have control, right? So I'm kind of ranting, but it's an exciting, exciting way of thinking about work, which I absolutely am eating this up. So thanks. Enough said.
Okay. Terri, do you have any comments about the question of autonomy?
I posted in the chat kind of a summary of it, that COVID has given us the opportunity to turn to leaders in these organizations and say, what did you learn from COVID? And then to guide that about what you learned is that autonomy has value to everyone. Autonomy has value to the people who do the work in your organization. Autonomy has value to the organization itself, because I can point to those examples where productivity went up, where retention went up, because of the autonomy that was forced into action, right? Not necessarily the organization saying, oh, I think this is a great idea, let's give everyone this kind of autonomy. But we now have data for their own company. They can't say, well, it won't work for me, because it did work for them, unless they went out of business, right? It did work for them. And even if it didn't work everywhere, they have examples of where it did work. And helping them learn from the tragedy is something, what I'll say is, the tragedy is so huge, we have to extract, it is our responsibility to extract every ounce of the value that we can take from all the hurt and the costs that we had to bear. So, it's a nice framing, and I've found it pretty effective that people do sit back and say, oh, I do have data. So they don't have to listen to me saying, well, I know what I'm talking about. I'm this, chaired professor. Instead, I can say, let's look at your own data and see what it says for you. I find great value in the Microsoft report, not necessarily in how they frame the conclusions, because they take a pretty negative angle on the data, even where they have charts showing improvements. So I don't know what kind of story they were trying to push there, but the data has great value. So I'll say, the Microsoft report is really great. I added the book title that Cindy mentioned up there in the chat. I'm looking here. Yeah, the system is often what gets in the way. Absolutely, Pierre. And yes, the job crafting exercises. Again, Ken, is that coming out of the Center for Positive Organizational Psychology?
You're on mute, Ken.
Yeah, thank you. So I understand it's illegal, but so please see to understand what's the job crafting exercise.
Okay. Yes, that's great. I'm trying to grab this link here. Positive Psychology Center. There's one at the University of Pennsylvania. I want the one in Michigan. Yeah, here we go. This in the chat. Great source of resources here. And like I said, I'm very focused on that left-hand side of the image. These folks cover more of the entire expanse of it. So I think you'll find some really useful resources in that group.
And I think one other thing that you do, Terry, is you bring technology more to the foreground.
Absolutely. In fact, let me do a little bit of that. So, I've been saying, we have 71 years of history that a minority of folks fully grasp the value of a socio-technical perspective, but not the majority. And we've tried and we've yet to figure out what the right key is to be able to open this up to everyone. And I continue that. And I'll say I've been working on this for at least the last 20 years to find a way to help folks see the interconnections across the talent, the technology, and the technique as they work towards targets and they adjust them appropriately for the times that they are working in. So the how we help, my advice is we need better branding. The only time I've heard socio-technical systems used in a sentence, not in one of my courses, is on, I think it was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they had gone off to college. So this is a kind of a comedy, in US comedy from the 1990s maybe. They'd gone off to college and they were coming back and they were talking about all the inane things they had learned. And one of the examples was this phrase, socio-technical systems. And I thought, that is tragic. We have to find a way to make the value be more apparent to people. So I'm going to claim branding, and I use it as kind of the touchstone. Think about Six Sigma. Many of you, your careers have spanned eras before Six Sigma. We always had quality control. It's been there since the Greeks. I've seen it in in automotive assembly plants where you had people making marks on the pillars in chalk, right? Statistical process control has been with us forever. It was when it got to be called Six Sigma, and you could be a Six Sigma black belt, that now anybody knows, at least tangentially, what this thing is and that it's a positive. So, or at least generally speaking, a positive. So what could we do? What kind of branding could we use? How can we help people keep these things easily in mind so that they can use them every day? Because we live our lives every day. We do our work every day. So the crafting that we need to do has to be multidimensional and it has to be interdependent. So here's my example. We see in 3D, we need to think in 5T. I went to the marketing literature and I said, what kinds of things make jingles and the like sticky? And so tropes are an advertising technique, and this is a trope we see in 3D. We need to think in 5T. My evidence from teaching a perspective, and evolutions of this perspective is that it is sticky. When I run into someone, years later who's been in a course of mine, they'll say, I still think about the 5 T's, right? So I know it sticks. So the 5 T's, I've been sort of saying these as I go along: talent, technology, technique. And for technology, I'll show kind of broader bases of this as we go along. Everything from AI to that is a ZAX. I had to find a Z technology. It's a roofing tool. So increase everybody's tool making vocabulary just a touch today, but align to the target, whatever that might be, and adjust it to your times. And again, COVID gives me a great backdrop for this, because I say in COVID times, how did you redesign your work? When you first went home, what did you do? How did you evolve it in the weeks that came after? How was it different from the weeks that were before March of 2019, at least in North America? So sharing this reframing of STS broadly, I absolutely do. And I try and find sort of easy ways to share the procedures of it and the interdependency, so people really get a grip on what it means to have that kind of joint optimization. And so, I do have data that says this can be learned from experience, that it can be taught. I'll share some examples of how I go about doing that. And I've shown this star a little bit already. And let's see, I'll move this up so you can see the link. And there you go. So thinking in 5T, and this is just a quick way to get people drawing it. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll draw it in various ways because not everything is equal. Some things may be very technologically heavy, other things may be very talent heavy or process heavy on the technique side. And so I'll draw it out in different ways. And I also use this tool, bring myself back down, this tool, and I've got one of them here. If anyone ever has a baby in my network, they end up with one of these. It's called a squish. And the idea, I got to get it lined up, is that if you just hold on to one thing and try and pull, and I'll generally say, you know, if you hand it to a really strong toddler and tell them just to pull on the end, what's going to happen eventually? Well, it's going to break. You know, you can't change just one thing. You know, if you think about how teams were brought into the US in the late 70s and early 80s, they sort of around like a fairy godmother going, you're a team now, you're a team now. And they didn't change the hiring, they didn't change the training, they didn't change the performance appraisal, they still haven't changed all that. So they changed one thing and it didn't always work, right? Because you can't change just one thing. You need to let other aspects, other dimensions move in concert, right? And so I end up using this a lot. And like I said, baby toys, it's a perfect gift to offer up. And then I give some hardcore, you know, clear examples that people hopefully will have heard of in the past. So something that people who do any kind of performance hacking these days may have seen is talent and thinking about your personal best time, how we're all a little bit different for whatever reason. And, you know, saying to them, you've probably heard about time blocking. Well, when you do time blocking, which I'll show as a technique, what time of day would be best for you to have that focus time? Have you found a way to measure that for yourself? And I use rescue time. And you know what rescue time tells me is 9 to 11 a.m. is when I am going to be able to nail my focus work. My writing will get done more effectively. And it's the time I do block on my calendar. So today was, you know, a little bit different because I was coming to meet with all of you, but this idea of finding your personal best time and then using it, making sure that they understand that technology is a very broad term, that even the furniture, the aspects of how we design our conference rooms is a piece of the technology, and highlighting for them maybe some of the tools that they're not aware of yet. Using rescue time as a way of figuring out what your personal best time might be, different collaboration technologies that might match your workflows better, sensors that we can use to track things. You know, we're all, many of us, we could do a little poll here. I won't stop us for the poll, but we could do a poll that would say, how many of us are wearing some kind of a fitness device on our arm? And what does it tell us about our work even? So the hardware and the software of your work and more, making them think about that very broadly. And I'll move this over here for a moment. I also, with an RA, keep track of the automations and especially the AI-enabled automations. And Cindy, I will say I have not had the opportunity to double check all of these and the bias checks that they may have used in the development of these particular tools. I think that the bias issue is such a huge one that, you know, the heavy big tech companies, as well as a huge component of researchers, are trying to figure that problem out. And they're likely going to have tools and techniques that can be fairly standardized so people can do those checks more effectively. And anyway, this terri.es is a short link /AI list. And I'll show an image of it here in a second. But my RA and I every quarter do an update of AI-enabled tools that individuals or small groups can use in the support of their work. So these are not things that require corporate databases to take advantage of, right? These are things like, can you improve the photo that you're going to use in your marketing material? And is there an AI capability for that? And technique, I'll go through the definitions and then I'll do another pause. Technique, I don't think any of you are going to find anything surprising in this. Just the how, the what. and in what order we do our work, our workflows, and how we figure that out. And workflows is a phrase that is becoming more used even in a general population, not just of people who do job design. Rescue Time is got a nice little blog about, what is a workflow anyway? Anyone whose organization has maybe done robotic process automation or RPA, they use that language of workflows. So people are gaining that vocabulary. How can we help them use those ideas in the betterment of their own work? So I'll pause here. We see in 3D, we need to think in 5T, and then kind of some focal questions. And we won't do this as a breakout, again, given our small size today, but whether and how you see work crafting and thinking in 5T is either aligned or not with your current practice. How could you help people think about the right cycle time? Every morning, should I be thinking about, I need to adjust my work, or is it once a week? Is it once a month, quarterly? How would you trigger work crafting? And what organizational supports is it crucial that management provide if this is going to be effective? So I'll stop there, and I'm going to take a quick moment to look at the chat. So let me play catch up here.
Okay. Yeah, there's lots in those questions, as you can see there. Each of them we could dive into separately, but what is it? Let's just do it randomly. What is provoked by those questions by anyone and all of you? I'm particularly interested to see how this might align with your current practice and what I would consider as Terri's rather user-friendly, practitioner-friendly way of describing STS.
Well, and hopefully individual worker-friendly.
Yeah, well, and I think, yeah.
I think Cindy really raised the issue of bias wonderfully, and it occurs to me that over the last couple of years, I've been challenged by numerous people to think about my own biases, and I'm wondering if this model doesn't help us look at that a little bit. Do I have biases regarding talent, technology, technique, target, and times that I'm operating on, or assumptions I'm operating on that I haven't really inspected, I haven't really thought about, and so it just in that as a personal checklist to look at myself, I think this little model, this little star that you've got, Terri, is really potentially very helpful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I will say that checklist is the word I would use. Sometimes, especially in an academic audience, they'll be going, well, is this a typology or a theoretical statement? And I'm very clear, this is not a shift in STS. It's just a different way of presenting it, right? All the theoretical dynamics of STS stay. It's just, I think this perspective is a little easier to talk through with folks who are not job design experts. And so checklist is a term I'll use a lot. And, okay, what's your target? And I do it either in spreadsheets, I can do it graphically, something that helps the people make sure, and I'll say it in this phrasing, make sure nothing falls through the cracks, right? Because all of us have our particular expertise, and the bias in terms of work crafting that I see in my courses, and these are typically working professionals who have an interest in innovation, is a general descriptor of my audience. But how do you make sure that nothing falls through the cracks? If you're a technology-centric person, don't be entirely focused on the technology. I will do it this way in terms of you can't change just one thing, sort of emphasizing that. No one hire is going to change everything. No one new technology tool is going to change everything. No new practice is going to change anything, or at least not effectively. It's that combination, making sure that you can figure out the right mix. And I will talk with them about negotiating that change thinking about who your stakeholders are. I typically put, I'll have an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet. I'll have the different stakeholders that go off across the top, and then down the rows, I'll put in the categories across the 5 T's, and I'll have them, specifically the 3 T's, the talent, technology, and technique for the most part, have those be the big headings, have somewhere, highlighted what is the contextual issues, what are the contextual issues that you may need to be paying attention to, what are the targets that you have to hit, keep those kind of top of mind, have them in a box in some way. And then underneath technology, talent, technique, what are the different dials you could turn? What are the different variables you have under your control? And then how are you going to find a way to integrate those at different levels? And what are those examples? So when I'm running a workshop on it, it's a combination of here's this thing, here are these dimensions to be thinking about and planning with. Now, as a practice, how do I come to one that's actually effective? And so different angles we can take. We can talk about negotiated change, especially if the work is more interdependent and any change you make might affect someone else either in your team or outside your team. The negotiated strategy is pretty effective there. If it's more of an individual contributor and maybe their work is a little bit less interdependent with their colleagues, then I'll have them think about maybe a lean startup approach about how are we going to run a set of lightweight experiments to figure out what is the best strategy for you to go. So using data to help them make those choices.
Okay. Any other?
I think for me, Bert, and this, I recognize this is sort of a mundane response, but having worked in a university for a long time where I had technical support, and now not in a university where I have to support myself in any kind of technology, I still find that there are many, I'll call them workarounds that I would like to use, but the cost to me in time to figure out how to use them is really great. And so that often prevents me from engaging in them. And and I think there are more and more people that are in my situation that are gig workers, so to speak. And so where's the support for them? I think we can always go to YouTube and but YouTube's often outdated. It might take you 15 tries to find something that actually answers your question. Mm-hmm. So I think support's a big issue for a lot of us, for even some of these simple things.
I'm just summarizing what I'm hearing there.
And does anyone else have that feeling, or am I alone in that?
I don't think that's a mundane comment, Nancy. That's pretty fundamental to this process.
And Nancy, I'll say it's at the heart of the question I asked about what's the right cycle time. If you're doing it every day, that would be, in the instance that I'm hearing you describe, that would be of huge cost. But perhaps what you're going to do, especially if support is on the table, that maybe, you could team up with, say, other freelancers and making sure there's a more technical freelancer in the group. There's someone with a little bit more organizational savvy, someone with maybe some training savvy, maybe get together as a mini guild. I love the idea of guilds. Get together as a mini guild, but say, we're going to do that, once a month. We're going to do that once a quarter. And we're each going to talk through and support each other in that effort.
That's a lovely idea, Terri. I've even got in mind my guild. So thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to offer one of those questions? Ken?
Yeah, it's not a question, but so this is my impression about the work crafting or life crafting, job crafting, because the crafting is another essence of the job crafting idea, because so nobody understands what the praxis means. So in other words, in the possible organizational scholarship said, so positive itself has meaning, because when we practice of inquiring what is a positive in everyday situation, and it's a chore, it's a house business or a small jobs or small tasks, all day long. The people sometimes think about, oh, this is my life, this is my joy. So it's a practice lead me to the way to the understanding of what is a positive, what is the job. It's a so in that sense, how do we understand the 5T models? So when I apply this model to explain that this is a tool to craft your life or make your life meaningful. So this is my curiosity.
Okay, I'm sort of combining Larissa's question a little bit with what I'm hearing from you, Ken, and I'm going to post this in the chat. You know, I have found huge value in applying the techniques of the book Getting to Yes, and then, you know, sort of the trainer's version, or the more sophisticated version of it is a book called Getting More of What You Want. And this idea of integrative negotiation, that all of life is an integrative negotiation, that we have stakeholders in everything we do. And then we have these categories in terms of technology and talent and technique. But what I hear Ken speaking to is especially the issue of what's our target. And so individually, I could have a work-related productivity target, but I could also have a target very specific to my life. And finding a way to negotiate your way to those targets is, you know, certainly complicated, requires transparency that I hope, if you're in an organization, is appropriate. I can say for sure that there are some organizations where they would say that issue of your work-life balance, of your quality of work life, that's not our concern. No, those organizations exist, and I hope that none of us end up in those. But the process remains the same. These ideas of integrative negotiation, where you are being incredibly thoughtful is a term I could use, but proactive as well in the planning of it. And when I teach negotiation, I every now and then end up teaching integrative negotiation on its own, but I generally teach it in support of negotiated change, focusing people in on the importance and the amount of time it takes to do the planning. You know, and just in your own world, you can think about, you know, the last time you negotiated a car. Some people don't want to spend any time in the preparation, and they're going to go into that car dealership. And, you know, certainly in supply chain situations today, we don't have any choice. So there's no negotiation. But in a normal world, they would just, someone who doesn't want to do that negotiation, doesn't want to spend any upfront time planning for it, walks into the dealership and just pays that sticker price. And there's a cost there. They're paying a higher price. Maybe they're not getting everything they want in that vehicle, but they gained in that they were able to say, I walked in the door and I bought that car and I left. I didn't incur the cost of the planning for the negotiation. I didn't incur the cost of having to deal with the back and forth. That's my mom. You know, she will not negotiate. So I tell her that's fine. It's just you're paying for that privilege.
Yeah.
Other folks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Culturally, Japanese doesn't like the negotiation in the conversation process, but we use the ownership of my life. So the ownership is a familiar term of when we use the negotiation so combine I'm sorry, I can't figure out the exact meaning, but so yeah, negotiating with others. So I understand. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah.
Pierre, do you want to make Pierre or Doug, is there anything you want to offer before we move on?
Yeah, what I said, Bert, I believe in job crafting, and I think it's a very normal process. Otherwise, people can do the jobs well. But what I said in the text, you all know the law of Newton, when he saw the apple falling on the tree. You know that law? And he's saying it's quite easy to go from the top to the bottom, but from the bottom to the top, it's very difficult. And I think that's the problem with job crafting. If the system is changing to allow that and to accept that, then it's really difficult. Then people go alienate of the work and go to negative things. So I don't know. I was Pete, I think, who said it's job crafting, work crafting, organization crafting, and ecosystem crafting and life crafting. So I think it should be an integrated whole and a whole system approach of all of that to make it successful. And I think that's important to understand. And maybe that's also why STS after 70 years is not easy to find it. People talking about lean, agile, that's nice stuff to do, but to reorganize the ecosystem, the organizations, that's really a hard job. And maybe managers don't like that, to have this big change in all integrated aspects of an organization. And maybe that's the problem of STS after 70 years.
Yeah, I will not dispute that you are far better off and much more likely to have success to the extent that all the different levels in that ecosystem are pointed in the same direction. Absolutely.
Yes.
But the good news, I think, is that we have evidence that even point solutions are beneficial for the individuals and can be beneficial for the teams.
Sure, yes.
But absolutely, to your point, they remain point solutions at that level. And how do we, or do we not? Do we just find the organizations that really understand how you want these things to be consistent?
That's maybe an interesting part of the conference in Austin. It's a difference between a greenfield and brownfield approach.
Right. Yeah, and Pierre, let me just make a quick comment here that again Terry can follow up on. But one of the ways in which I think the concept of work crafting fits quite well with what we tend to do in terms of organizational crafting or system-wide crafting.
Yes.
Terry has a concept of white space, that in those change efforts that we're involved with, and I've been working right now with people on developing hybrid forms of work organizations, there's all sorts of white space where there's not changes made that people can pick up on individually, continuously, and spontaneously. So to me, it is in terms of the levels that you spoke to, Pierre, it's a great complement. It's something that if you can do it simultaneously, will make the whole process more powerful and more sustainable.
Yes. Yeah. I agree with you, Bert. Yeah.
But that requires a level of personal autonomy that goes beyond what are the current requirements of my position to thinking laterally in terms of processes and being willing to step up and at some potential risk to try to create sort of a common agenda across the other players in that process. If I'm using the term white space the same way you are, Terry, it's the space between the boxes.
Yeah, space between the boxes, absolutely. So if you think about the formal plan, or it comes from work on org charts, right, originally, but I think it can be used in any of these versions. So if you think about, if I draw the model of what this change is going to look like, there's a whole lot of white space left as I do that.
And in the years that I've been consulting, I have seen some examples of people willing to do that, but they do run some risks, and they have to be incredibly effective at mobilizing people and building that common agenda.
Right.
So,
and this is where Terri, Doug, in parts we're not going to get to in detail, but she does speak to in the guide that she's developed, speaks to the process of interaction that needs to take place between individuals and teams and organizations, and the sort of support structure. Come back to Nancy's comment.
Case about an individual who did that around the need for asset protection and creating a common approach across a fairly large global company. And so he took on the white space stuff. It wasn't specifically his job responsibility, but it came to his attention because of small capital projects that he was responsible for in his role.
Right.
But the director of corporate security was good at cops and robbers, but not good at mobilizing people. And so this individual very effectively worked behind the scenes and in his own way, without the availability of Kotter's model, just used some of the elements of Kotter's change model. So it was him really stepping up to another level of accountability. See it, own it, do something about it. So.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm about to type into the chat. I mentioned this term, excuse me, system savvy. And in my academic work, that's what I call the capability of either through training or experience or just insight, the ability to see the different dimensions and then find ways to optimize across them. So that people who do that either through training or naturally have what we call and can measure as system savvy. And, as you guys will certainly, I think, support, it's fairly rare. And the example that we just heard is absolutely someone that I would have then chased down when I was writing my book in 2012 called The Plugged In Manager. And I looked for those examples, and it was really interesting that I could go into an organization and I could say, do you have people like that? And I could, give an example, and they go, oh, yes, this person is exactly that kind of person. So they were rare, but they could be identified. And then once you identified them, you could get them to sort of tell the story of how they came to have that skill set. And, one of my favorite examples was a fellow who had grown up with his mother being a wedding planner, and he goes on to be a Boeing engineer. And he said that wedding planner experience of working, for his mom all those years and seeing people in every aspect of their lives, both highs and lows, that made him the engineer and the manager that he was at that moment. And, being able to distill those things is really the foundation of everything we've been talking about today. So I'm going to just type in system savvy into the notes, because I'm
sure. A much better phrase than Trist used. Trist described them as reticulists.
Yeah, let's go back to the branding problem we have here, right?
I'm interested, Don, in your views. We haven't heard your voice. How are you thinking about all of this?
Hi, Nancy, and everyone. I have an interesting story about the 1965 paper of Eric and Fred. That was the first paper on open systems theory and was presented to the Academy of Management. And they pointed out that von Bertalanffy's model had no definition of the external environment. The external environment was used as a variable within the system. And they thought that was wrong. So in their model, they developed a view of the environment, and they presented 4 different environments. At the end of that presentation, they said, there was not a comment. There was not a question. There was silence. The top managers in the academy management had no idea what they were talking about. And it relates, Terry, to what you're saying about being able to see the system. You can't see the system from within mechanism or organicism. You have to get into contextualism. And that's been the difficulty. I think in terms of learning, my second comment is I work with OST and participative design. So the training program is participative design. You do a participative design workshop to learn what it is, learn how to use it. Then you decide to do it for real. You do it for real, you get results. And pretty soon you start seeing the work teams organizing themselves into mini participative design workshops that they do in a couple of hours, not in a day. That they're getting the concepts and using them in the way that they think through and solve their problems. So the training, the learning is within the practice.
Mhm.
Can you put something in the chat about participative design, Don? I'd appreciate that.
Sure. You want a reference?
That would be lovely.
The other, Terry, do you have any comment on a follow-up to what Don just said?
I just made sure I got it into the notes, and that when I talk about lightweight experiments, I would say that that is just maybe the modern phrasing of that. You know, so if you have folks who have been trained in the lean startup and they know about going out with something that's like the minimum viable product and testing to see how it's working, or testing the leap of faith assumptions that they're making, then you can say to these folks, that's exactly what we mean. Just turn that perspective onto your own work, right? So I'm always looking for what are they already expert in? And that's really what led me to use negotiation. Everyone at least thinks they're capable of negotiating, you know, maybe not well, but they at least know what the concept is and what the basic tenets are, that I'm going to work with people to come to an agreement that we can all walk away with as something that we can live with. And then some people are really good at it, and you can get better. We know that you can become a better negotiator. And so that's something I can pin these ideas to and say, you don't have to learn a new process. You know, this is what you need to be thinking about. These are the issues on the table. Now use your existing negotiation skills to figure that out for your own work. Similarly, if you're a lean startup kind of setting, use those. If you're a Six Sigma setting, use those dynamics. They can all be pointed towards your own work. Just keep in mind the 5 T's. And you know, building on, you know, the fact that they already know the process piece is a huge jump. We just have to make sure that they don't try and change just one thing, that they're actually thinking about this in the more systemic way. And so just being able to draw a 5-pointed star with a set of lines linking those tips, that can be a great foundation. And then, you know, as I was saying, you know, my own personal focus, because we're coming right to the end of our time, my personal focus is around the automations that are exploding in terms of their capabilities, both good and bad. But I do update this list quarterly, and I hope it provides some value to you. There are some amazing tools in there. Every time I go in, you know, even though, you know, I've been involved in the creation of the list, I don't usually have time when we're doing the update to think about how could I use that? And when I do, you know, there are some amazing tools in there. And then finally, I'll leave this phrase with you, and right in that most bright section, that's the little piece of Vancouver I hang out in. And the thing that's kind of fun is the distance from the bottom part of that bright component to the top is just a little over a mile. You know, Vancouver is a very walkable city. But all my contact information is there. And I very much look forward to being able to continue this. If we're not already connected on LinkedIn, I hope you won't mind, but I'll be sending out a link request. I hope we can connect those dots. And thank you, Bert, for putting in that book title. That's the 2012 thinking on it. But I do talk about using negotiation. But clearly what triggered this whole thinking in 5T approach was even my attempt with plugged-in management to make this be something that everyone could grasp onto. I wasn't seeing that it was sticky. I knew I still hadn't found the right phrasing, and maybe I've found it now. Well, time will tell, and hopefully it will be helpful to you.
Well, thank you, Terri. There's lots more that we could delve into in this, but at least you've begun the process for us, so that's great. Yeah. All right, I guess we have to call it time, right, Pete?
Well, I suppose we do, but it's been excellent. Terri, thank you very much. And what a delight, Nancy, to have your niece Cindy with us. She seems like an amazing lady. And
she is indeed. Yeah, she is.
Yeah, you must pull her more tightly into this community.
I think we've hooked her.
Good.
Excellent. Well, everyone have a great rest of your day, and please do let me know how else I can help.
Thank you very much, Terri.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.